in that respect. And Spengler befriended him briefly, and he began to pick up from Frobenius this understanding of what was then called primitive man. That term is not politically correct anymore, so now we have indigenous cultures or aboriginal cultures. And Spengler, in the last few years of his life, was at work on another giant work that was to be the sequel to Decline of the West, or rather a prequel, I suppose you could say, because it was to deal with prehistoric man from the period of the Neanderthal clear up to the rise of the high civilizations, in Sumer in 3500 BC. So he was going to cover that whole period, and he was working with the different cultural epochs in that period. All we have of that book are these notes that have not been translated out of the German. So Spengler was moving at the end of his career into the archaic and magical, but he never did recognize anything of value in contemporary culture. So now the best place to start here is by looking at two of these fundamental mutations of consciousness through the arts. And I still don't have the trick for that. Magic touch.
You did it up there.
Huh?
You did it up there.
Mean machine. We just don't get along. It took me 2 years to learn how to drive a clutch car. So the two mutations that I just want to start off, and this is a good way to do it, looking at art history, because it's concrete and you can see, you can actually watch the process happen instead of just hearing about it conceptually, and then we'll talk about it conceptually after we look at the actual process. So the process that we'll be looking at are two mutations. The birth of perspective in painting, that's the perspectival consciousness structure, which comes in about 1500 AD. Here we're back in 1308, before that's taken place. And then the one that took place in the end of the 19th century when perspective shifted into aperspectivity. So we'll look at those two mutations. And here's an example of sort of what Gebser calls the unperspectival world, the unperspectival style of painting, sort of where there is no real sense for space at all. Time is here. This is within the sort of mythical consciousness structure. Time is cyclical, but the world is essentially spaceless. There is no, the human really has no feeling for three-dimensionality whatsoever. And instead, there's a sense for the spiritual dimension. And the more important the figure is spiritually, the larger the figure is represented in the painting. So we're not representing pictorial space here at all. You can see this sort of, there's a slight perspectival slant here, but it isn't very well thought out. And the next important thing to watch for is this gold background here. The gold background was the basic style for backgrounds in that whole Magian period of the Byzantine world. The Byzantine mosaic style always has these little gold backgrounds. And then the Europeans, when they began to paint, starting with Cimabue and Giotto, and here we have Duccio, who are all contemporary, they pick up, with this sort of pseudomorphosis still under the influence of the Magian culture. They're painting this gold background because gold is the symbol of the spirit. In alchemy, it's the metal that is incorruptible. It does not rust. It is the solar metal, and it is the best symbol for the spirit. So we have that gold background there, and that will gradually vanish. And keep in mind, too, that with respect to yesterday's concept of the pseudomorphosis, the false formation, that when a new culture is coming into being, this is the same. We don't even really need to take the term for mineralogy, come to think of it, because it's the same phenomenon every time a painter starts to paint and then learns, long before he develops his or her style. If you get, the collected works of, say, Cézanne or Van Gogh or something, look at the first few paintings, and they're always recapitulating the styles of the masters that have come before them. Long before they can find what their own style is going to be, they have to start out by imitating what's gone before. And so in that sense, the early works are a false formation until the true soul of, Picasso, for example, appears in the painting that we'll see, Demoiselle d'Avignon, where suddenly he's no longer just imitating Cézanne and the Impressionists. There is Picasso as we know him, and it's consistent to the rest of his career. So the same thing happens anytime somebody sets out to do anything creative. You have to start by imitating models. And With respect to the pseudomorphosis concept, though, specifically with respect to the influence of Magian culture on Northern Europe, that is to say the Christian, in our case the Christian is really the only one significant, that would be Christian, Hebraic, and Islamic, because the Islamics were kicked out and the Hebrews have never been looked on very kindly in our culture at all. So it was really only the Christians that had this heavy influence on us. So we're still within, and the main thing about that Magian pseudomorphosis is that the universe is a cavern. The mosque is the great configuration of space as a world cavern. And this closed-in feeling of a closed cavern universe is sort of the task that we had to set ourselves to break out of if we were going to achieve something fundamentally new in cultural history. So we'll watch as this cavern disintegrates. And I think Annunciation paintings are one of my favorite styles, just one of my favorite art motifs in classical painting. And I think if we look at a history, if we just look at a series of Annunciation paintings, and it's a nice way to focus on and watch the disintegration of this closed cavern. Here, this is actually the Annunciation to the Virgin of her death. So it's atypical in the series, but it's basically the same idea. The angel Gabriel is always coming in from the left, and the Virgin is always on the right. So we have a movement from left to the right. Gebser will say that's significant because anytime you have a movement toward the right, you have a movement toward consciousness, towards an awakening of consciousness. Anytime you have a movement toward the left, you're going to have a devolution of consciousness, a regression back into the abyssal energies that have brought forth waking consciousness. And in fact, he'll say it is very significant that it was in the West that reading from left to right was invented, in the West. All the other cultures in the East read from right to left. They're going in the direction of the abyssal energies, but it was beginning with the Greeks that this reading from left to right began, in addition to the alphabet, and there was a movement toward awakening consciousness just in that. So Gebser looks at all these little details, as does Spengler, and he sees these wonderful significances that can so easily be missed. So just note the fact that everything is very closed in. It's in this sort of suffocating little room here. It's the Magian cavern universe. And notice that in the background here, there's just nothing. Instead of the gold background, we just have this sort of black, empty void, as though we were literally in a cave. Yes, if you can figure it out. It's sort of bothering me, and I'm trying not to pay attention to it. This is Fra Angelico. He was a pupil of Giotto. Generally, when you look at textbooks of Western art, they always say that Northern European painting begins with Giotto. Giotto is a contemporary of Dante. They're both living. In fact, I think Giotto painted Dante's portrait. But now we have the problem. And so this is Fra Angelico's Annunciation. And Fra Angelico was really fascinated, as I am, with Annunciations because he painted a whole series of them. And this is one of his earlier ones. I think this is dating from the 1430s. So we're a century away from Duccio here, 1430. And that just took a chemist to figure that one out. I'd like to get the focus on that because there's a detail. Which one is focus? This one? Yeah. Because now the outer world is beginning to come in here. You can see this outer world, this garden, but notice that it's not yet a real outer world. It's allegorical of Adam and Eve being expelled from the garden. So it's a spiritual, symbolic exterior, but an exterior nonetheless. And there's the descent of the Spirit coming in. Gabriel comes in. And notice here that the canopy up here is represented as a spangled sort of starry sky. So we still have this closed-in womb and this idea of the heavens. The night sky is this sort of starry closed womb. Another comment Gebser will make is he says if you look at, he's very keen on etymology, looking at the history of the evolution of consciousness through language. He says if you notice in German,